Islam hasn't changed since its founding. It is every bit as backward, it is every bit as barbaric as it has ever been. So why is it that when we come to Islam, there's a complete failure to understand the connection between the religion and the evil actions? I mean, we skip forward half a century and people are flying planes into the sides of buildings, not ships this time, but into the sides of buildings. And the answer that you received at the time for why that was happening was because these people were crazy. Given the lengthy history of Islam, I mean, Islam isn't new. It's not some cult that just appeared, in Arabia, in the last decade. It's been around for a very long time. So why is there this failure, chiefly among Western scholars, to understand it? Imagine a terrorist attack, a bombing, a car careening through a crowd of people, knifings, beheadings, kidnappings. Until you have identified a swatting, if I'm going to speak very personally, until you have identified the evil idea behind the evil action, you have no hope of preventing it from happening again, because you are never really going to get at the root cause that's driving it. Instead, you'll come up with all kinds of silly peripheral reasons, that it's because of guns, that it's because of global warming, that it's because of, Western imperialism or something like that. You will never prevent it until you identify the idea. Because as we say on this show, ideas have consequences. So let me give you a really good example of what I'm talking about. I think if you were to ask any veteran of the Second World War, specifically veterans of the Pacific War, and were to say to them, why were kamikazes flying planes into ships? Why were they flying them into people? What was behind that? I think any veteran of that war who was reasonably informed would say to you, well, there is a connection between the actions of Imperial Japan and emperor worship. They fervently believed in their emperor. They were willing to die for their emperor. They were willing to give their lives. They were willing to kill other people in suicide actions in order to serve their emperor. Such was their fervent belief. So why is it that when we come to Islam, there's a complete failure to understand the connection between the religion and the evil actions? I mean, we skip forward half a century and people are flying planes into the sides of buildings, not ships this time, but into the sides of buildings. And the answer that you received at the time for why that was happening was because these people were crazy. It was because they were crazy. There was either an unwillingness or an inability to connect the evil idea that was behind the evil action. Now, I'm kind of continuing a thread on this show today about some things that we've been discussing on and off for the last couple of months. And it has to do with that religion. It has to do with religion in general. I'm an atheist concerning every religion, ladies and gentlemen, save one. And that is the Christian faith, because I believe that Jesus Christ is real. I believe that he appeared here on earth in human form. I believe he was crucified and resurrected and ascended into heaven, and today sits on the right hand of God, the Father Almighty, who is maker of heaven and earth. I'm an atheist concerning all other religions, but not all other religions have the same kinds of violent consequences, outbursts that we see in the Islamic world and driven by the Islamic faith. Why is it that there seems to be, given the lengthy history of Islam, I mean, Islam isn't new. It's not some cult that just appeared, in Arabia, in the last decade, and we're still trying to wrap our heads around what it is and what's driving it. It's been around for a very long time. So why is there this failure, chiefly among Western scholars, to understand it? Now, I have been doing for some time now, I've been doing a survey of available literature on Islam that I could recommend to people, that I could recommend to you, that I can recommend to friends, that I could recommend to supporters of this show. And I want to recommend things to you that I've read. I want to recommend things to you that I believe are solid and good and will lead you towards truth, will lead you towards understanding. And to that end, I've been surveying the literature to see what I could find. You know, what is there out there that I could say, this is the book? This is the book you could read. And, you know, one of the things that I discovered, and I may even have one or two of them up here, I'm not sure, is there's almost nothing that I can with confidence recommend to you. There is almost nothing. There are some books. Some of you will probably drop into the notes a few books that you've read that you thought were helpful, but there's almost nothing. And you say, what do you mean? If I go on Amazon and were to search Islam, I would find, 1,000 books, maybe more, that are available for sale there at Barnes and Noble or your local bookstore. True. That is true. But I found that there was always something missing. And you see, there are a number of scholars, historians, people who are pretty degreed up, who are writing on this topic and have been writing on it and speaking on it for a very long time. People who, who are regarded as top-notch scholars in the field. And yet when I often go read their books, the things they have to say about it, I come away with this kind of a knot in my stomach, this feeling that they don't really get it. And you may say, somebody just did in the comments, boy, that's awfully arrogant of you. How dare you think you know more than all these other people? I don't make that claim. But I do make this claim that many times they fail to understand Islam. They fail to understand Islam. So I will be reading a book, and I will find that the author has detailed Islam's history, its differences, the internal disputes, political struggles, its objectives, key figures, and so on. But I come away feeling like they don't really understand the engine that is driving Islam. And the reason I realized, I finally put my finger on it, is because most Western scholars are very secularly minded, irreligious, and having few religious impulses, beliefs of their own. We all tend to do this. We tend to judge other people by ourselves, unless you're really conscious of the fact that you're doing this and you seek to nullify your own biases in this regard. But Western scholars frequently do not understand Islam because they themselves are secularly minded. And the assumption is that the violence they see coming out of Islam must be due to something other than the theological underpinnings of that religion. Do you follow me? Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? So they look at the issue and they say, well, gosh, the terrorist acts of 9/11, of the shoe bomber, of, the USS Cole, of Charlie Hebdo, and on and on and on, that has to be driven by something other than religion. They always seem to arrive at a conclusion that doesn't have the religion, its own evil theology, as being the driver behind it. So they arrive at the conclusion, they go, well, it must be because of Western imperialism, Western oppression. It must have to do with poverty. These are people lashing out, because they're angry. I've read one who says it's because they feel very disenfranchised from society, as if we all just need a group hug and they just need to be included. Or maybe it has to do with, again, CNN was reporting when I was doing all this work going back and forth to South and Central America, tracking these caravans of illegal aliens. They were saying that all that was being driven by climate change, not by socialism, not by Marxism, not by how that ideology had destroyed whole economies in South and Central America, causing people to flee so they could feed their families. They were not arriving. Now, in that case, it was because of sheer dishonesty. I think they knew. I think they knew it had nothing to do with global warming. Oh, maybe some of the people at the bottom of that media pyramid don't know any better, and they're true believers in everything that's being told to them, by their higher ups. But the people who are really driving forces within these media agencies, they didn't believe that. They didn't think that was the reason behind it. They knew what was causing it. They knew it was government instability. They knew that it was because of Marxism. And look what is done to Venezuela, once the richest country in South America. It's dishonesty. But when it comes to Islam, I don't think the failure of Western scholars to understand it is actually due to some kind of, plot to prevent people from knowing the truth. I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's because of their lack of intelligence. Often these are people who are highly intelligent, highly educated. I don't think it has to do with a lack of access to manuscripts or key sources or key people. I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think it has to do with the fact that secularly minded people have difficulty in understanding religion in general, and therefore shouldn't write on it. At certain times, wise investors look for stability. Markets are overinflated, inflation remains a concern, and global tensions continue to rise. That's why many are turning to the safety of physical gold and silver. Alpha Omega Gold is a Christian-owned precious metals company known for honesty, transparency, and biblical stewardship principles. Their team help clients protect their investment with integrity and clear guidance, never pressure. Right now, Alpha Omega Gold is offering a free precious metals navigation guide to explain why owning gold and silver can be a smart, strategic hedge for retirement accounts and long-term security. Don't wait until economic shifts impact your future. So today, go and visit www.ao.gold/IHC or call 855-4AO-GOLD. That's 855-426-4653. Call today to learn how simple it can be to secure what matters most. I recall the late historian Forrest McDonald, a mentor of mine, guided my thesis when I was in graduate school. A very interesting man, Pulitzer Prize nominee, an eminent historian. I remember him asking me if I had read Barbara Tuchman's book, A Distant Mirror, which is about the Middle Ages. And Barbara Tuchman was trained as a journalist. She wasn't trained as a historian. And yeah, she wrote a brilliant little book that maybe some of you have read, published, I think, in 1964, called The Guns of August. It's an excellent book. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. It's about the first month of World War I. But like most of us, when you have success in one field, you start thinking yourself an expert in others. This has happened to so many people that I know, that having achieved wildly in one direction, you start thinking, you know what? I know a lot about everything. And you begin, believing that regarding yourself. And she got a little over her skis because she went, even though it won awards, she went and wrote a book on the Middle Ages. And because Tuchman was irreligious, she didn't understand the Middle Ages. And I remember McDonald saying to me, "Hey, Larry, did you read Tuchman's book, A Distant Mirror?" And I said, "No, I hadn't read it." He said, "Well, let me tell you, she's utterly unqualified to write a book like that." And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because she does not understand religion, and she definitely doesn't understand the Christian religion or the people of the Middle Ages who fervently believed in their religion. And therefore, she's approaching the Middle Ages like someone approaching the Black Forest without a map." She has no way of penetrating the mentality of that period. She just simply can't do it. And I would say that that's also true of a number of other historians I can think of in some other fields. I mean, take, for instance, William Manchester's book, also on the Middle Ages. William Manchester wrote a brilliant, he didn't write the trilogy. He wrote the first two volumes of the trilogy, The Last Lion. And my friend who I've had on this show, Paul Reed, wrote the third volume because Manchester died. But the Churchill biography, The Last Lion, which is really, really excellent. But he went from there to writing on the Middle Ages with a little book called A World Lit Only by Fire. And I remember reading that and thinking, I don't think this book achieves what it's seeking to achieve here. I don't think that Manchester actually understands the Middle Ages. I don't think he understands the mindset, but he's in his elements in the 20th century, specifically during World War II. And that's because he was alive then. He was a soldier then when he wrote his brilliant book, An American Caesar, about Douglas MacArthur. Manchester served under MacArthur. So he came with some qualification. He came with some understanding. Islam presents great difficulty to the Western mind. And it's because its theological inner workings are murky, obscure, Bronze Age. And Western scholars have great difficulty in understanding what it means. So here I am surveying all this literature, trying to find something. And I'm like, why is it that these guys who are so well educated don't seem to understand Islam? They understand its history, they understand a lot of its politics, but they don't understand the religion itself. And then I came across Aurora Mardiganian's little book, devastating little book, called Ravished Armenia. Ravished Armenia. Now, I've mentioned it on the show before, quite recently, and I now mention it again because I really want to encourage you to read it. And I don't have a copy of it right here because my wife took it. So presumably she is reading it. But I've bought about 30 copies of this book and have been handing it out to friends that they would read this. It's about the size of this book, a book that we mentioned last week, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. It's about 90 pages, no more than 100, and it's an easy read. And once you start reading it, you won't be able to put it down. But Mardiganian's book, Mardiganian was not a scholar. I don't mean she wasn't intelligent. I don't mean that she didn't have education. I just simply mean she wasn't an Islamic scholar. She wasn't an academic. And yet she understood Islam very well. She understood it far better than any of the books that I've been perusing on this subject. Typically by the ivory tower academics who always misattribute the violence of Islam. They attribute it to something other than what is actually driving it. And Mardiganian got it. Now, why did she understand? Why did she get it? She was a survivor of the Armenian genocide, and Armenia at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, which was an Islamic state. This is very frequently, again, Tuchman leaves these kinds of things out, and that's because she doesn't get it. When she's talking about, even in the Guns of August, she's not really talking about that aspect of Turkey, which she only discusses very, very briefly. But Mardiganian does, and it's because of her own suffering at the hands of Muslims. Now, I've said this many times, and I want to say it again. My contention is not that every Muslim is a terrorist or a would-be terrorist. My contention is that Islam is utterly incompatible with the West. Now, I've seen my own state senator, Tommy Tuberville, talking about how Sharia law, Sharia should be banned from the United States. Now, we've discussed this, but I would go a step further than that. Islam should be banned from the United States because many of its tenets, many of its core beliefs are antithetical to our Constitution. It's not simply that it's an alien ideology and they don't tend to assimilate particularly well. It is strictly speaking, it's a criminal ideology because it violates our laws when it's taken seriously. It must. That's what it is. And Marta Ganian, she got this because, again, being a survivor of the Armenian genocide, which took place, 1914, 15, 16, where roughly 1 million Armenians were mass deportations, murdered, men, women, and children murdered. Girls who were deemed to be attractive were taken off into to slavery to be sold in the Muslim slave markets, which is still going on today. And I'll come back to this in just a moment. But here she was. She's 13 years old. She witnesses the murder of her own family. And the Ottomans, again, who are Muslims, it was an Islamic state. They deemed the Armenians to be fair game because they were mostly of Christian heritage. Not all of them, but most of them were of Christian heritage. And the result was that, this mass slaughter, this mass conquest, and these girls, young girls who are forced marched thousands of miles to these slave markets where Marta Ganian and numerous others were sold repeatedly as concubines in these Muslim slave markets. And frequently what happened, as she reports, is that they would be brought together perhaps into a room where you had some kind of enforcer there who would ask the girls if they wanted to convert to Islam. And if any of them said no, they would be beaten to death right there in front of everyone, and their mangled body draped from the ceiling. And then they would ask the girls again, do you want to convert? And of course, in almost every instance, they all did. And Marta Ganian herself says that she would say the words and do the prayers that the Muslims required of her, while always in her heart saying, the words of a hymn or of scripture or something, and always asking the Lord to please forgive her that she was in this situation where she's forced to do this. But she says, but I never converted, in my heart. I never converted in my heart. Islam is often referred to as I'm absolutely killing this episode, by the way. We are being choked and we are absolutely being throttled on social media. And it's because I speak very plainly about these kinds of things and YouTube doesn't like it. But anyway, we proceed. Islam is frequently spoken of as the fastest growing religion in the world. And there's a reason for that. It's because conversions are made at sword point, at the point of an AK-47 or a machete. That's the way Islam grows. It's what it's done throughout all of its history. And reading this little book and recommending it to you, I do so because she gets it. As she's telling her story of what happened to her, her story, we could put it right alongside of what British girls have been saying have been happening to them in places like Rotherham. I mean, there's some modest differences, but it's almost entirely the same. She says, as she is being sexually assaulted, that her attacker would be quoting from the Quran while doing it. This is exactly what we've been hearing recently from girls who are survivors, victims of what happened in Rotherham, and all over Britain, and quite frankly, all over Europe. But it's not just in Europe. It's just we're only in recent decades seeing it in a big way in Europe. But it's happening all over Africa. It's happening all over Asia. It's happening all over the Middle East. The slave trade today is bigger than at any time in human history. And if you were to go on, your cell phone, it doesn't matter if you're an Android user or you have an iPhone. If you go on right now, You can pause the show right now and go and look on, we'll put it up here. We'll give you a screenshot of it. Go and look for this app. This app is called For Sale, but you will find there an English version of the app on the Apple App Store. You'll also find it on the Google App Store, in both places. And there's an English version of the app, and then there is an Arabic version of the app. Girls are being sold there. They're being sold. And in spite of the fact that these companies all profess to be deeply concerned with human rights and human rights abuses, and that they're committed to stopping human trafficking, this app has been pointed out to them repeatedly, and there have been requests to get them to remove it from their app stores, and both have refused to do it. Now, how are they sold on there? You mean like, can you type in there like girls for sale? No, that's not the way it works. They're being sold on there. You'll see their faces and everything else. They're being sold on there as domestic servants. So it'll have a description and it'll say, Sarah. Sarah works very hard. She's very mindful of pleasing, her employer. She has a pleasant disposition. She's this, that, and the other. And it'll have her picture. And it's just like you're selling a car, selling a bicycle. You go on there and you see how to contact, the owner. And then you can request to meet Sarah or whoever, or meet the owner, and then the transaction takes place. The money amount is even listed there, of how to get a hold of these people. And where are the girls coming from? These days, they're chiefly coming out of North Africa. This is kind of brings us back to what we've been talking about with Nigeria. Except for this. And this speaks to an aspect of Islam that no one really wants to talk about either, and that's that it's racist. Muslims, as a rule, and again, I'm speaking of Islam when it's taken very seriously, Arab Muslims see black people as beneath them. They're worthy only of being workers. And as a rule, they're not as highly valued in the sex trafficking trade. They're looking for lighter-skinned girls where they can find them. This is what's going on, and this is exactly the story that Aurora Mardiganian is telling in Ravished Armenia. Now, that book, her book, was published in 1919. And you may say, well, a book like that, it's old. In the Western mindset, lacking as it does an appreciation for, an understanding of history, and seeing continuity between one epoch and another, we have been conditioned to believe in the West that only that which is new is relevant. Only that which is new is worthwhile. I recall a Cambridge scholar saying in his lectures when I was a student in the UK, I remember him saying this. I thought it was quite fascinating. He said, in your own advertising, all you have to do is say new. And Americans have been conditioned to assume the rest of that it means improved. So you just go new Tide detergent. He said in Britain, we would be very suspicious of that kind of marketing. I don't know if that's true anymore, but he says we would be very suspicious of that kind of marketing because a British housewife would say, but what was wrong with the old formula? But Americans think new means improved. Americans think new is relevant. It's always troubled me how hard it has always been to get students, to get people in general to read anything that's quote unquote old. And some of it is the best literature that you can access and read. But they want the latest thing. They want to be reading at the beach what other people are reading at the beach. They want to be deemed relevant, on top of things. And so the idea of going and reading a book from the 1850s has very little appeal to them. It's unfortunate because it's not the way Muslims think. Muslims think in terms of a very deep history, For them, the conquest of the West is all about the reversal of the setback, as they see it, caused by the Crusades. This is we thought those wars were over centuries ago. From a Muslim perspective, it never ended. That war is continuing, and they're determined that they will win it, that they will reverse the setbacks caused by the Crusades. The rise of the West, they think, is a complete accident of history. It isn't. It's the result of the rise of the Christian faith. Even Neil Ferguson, Oxford and Harvard historian Neil Ferguson, who, by the way, last I heard is an atheist, even Neil Ferguson attributes it to the rise of Christianity, the rise of capitalism, the rise of science, the rise of art and literature, the rise of technological military superiority over the rest of the world may be attributed to the rise of the Christian faith. But Muslims have always seen that as an accident of history, that it should have been them, and that the reason it wasn't them is due to the Crusades, at least in part. And they're determined to reverse that. You have to be willing to look at history, to survey some of the literature that went before us, because sometimes those are the people who actually knew things that we need to know now. I realized when I was writing on and speaking on and addressing the issue of Marxism that I ran into kind of the same problem, that there were so many people today that they have this kind of, how shall I put it, a sort of clinical distance from it. And as a result, they don't really get it. Whereas if you go and look at let's say the memoirs, the testimonies of people who suffered under Marxism, who suffered in communist Russia or China or Vietnam, who suffered the purges, whose families were destroyed, children sent to orphanages, husbands sent to Siberia, wife no longer employable. Those people get it, and that's because they were inside it. And they speak about it with passion, and they speak about it with conviction, and they do not have the clinical, distance from the issue. The same can be said for Islam. And as we're talking about this, as I say, Marta Ganian's book is only about this size, but Marta Ganian's book, Ravished Armenia, she's giving you a picture of Islam from the inside. And because she's a Christian, and because it was her Christian faith that sustained her throughout all of this, she understood Islam. She knew what was going on. She knew what it was about. And she describes it beautifully in her little book that was published in 1919. And again, don't think that because it's more than a century old that it's not relevant. I promise you it's highly relevant, because the exact same things are happening today. They're just happening. The technology is different. She wasn't being sold on an app. She was being sold in an actual slave market where she's standing on a block and people are inspecting her teeth and taking her clothes off. But it's the same. It's exactly the same. Islam hasn't changed since its founding. It has not changed. It is every bit as backward. It is every bit as barbaric as it has ever been. And I can think of, for any Westerner seeking to understand Islam, I can think of no better place to start than with Marta Ganian's book, Ravished Armenia. Again, I bought many copies. It's available on Amazon for $7.99. We'll put it in the show notes. We'll link it there and you can get it. That's in paperback. I'm sure you can find it in hardback or something else. But the book itself is almost utterly forgotten, and it's only been recently that people have begun to publish it again. And it's small publishers who are publishing it. It isn't my publisher, HarperCollins or anybody like that who has it or is interested in it. To my knowledge, it's small printing houses, often Christian printing houses, or maybe those with a particular interest in the Armenian genocide who are talking about it. Now, Yesterday, I sat down and I watched several videos of interviews with her. She died in relative obscurity in Los Angeles in 1994, and you can find some interviews with her as an old woman. She when that book was published, she went on a big speaking tour all over the United States, raising money to bring relief to the Armenian people, but by the 1920s, she was out of the public eye and didn't reemerge again until the 1980s. And even then, it seems fairly reluctantly. But in 2022, Armenia submitted, I think at the Cannes Film Festival, maybe it was the Sundance Film Festival, but one of those prestigious film festivals, Armenia submitted a film about her life titled Aurora's Sunrise. Now, I watched it yesterday. I rented it on Amazon and watched that film. And I was struck by the fact that there were quite a few differences in the film than from the book. And I don't think that's because, the book or the film are a lie. I think it's because the book, as I said, is very short. It's like this. And this is her life over the course of many years. They're probably kind of like the Gospels. The Gospels don't all contain some of the same stories. They overlap, but they also contain stories that are uniquely, their own. And that's because each writer was offering his own perspective, and certain things struck certain writers as more significant than others. Or perhaps they had a slightly different purpose in the way they were telling the stories. Maybe in Matthew's case, he's pointing Jews to the fact that this is the Messiah, whereas in the case of John, he's arranging his stories that are building from small miracles, the turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana, all the way to the resurrection. So there are some differences, and so it is here. She is in. The film is based not just on the book, it's based on her interviews. And so she sometimes is telling stories that aren't in the book. And it's also because the book was published in 1919, and she's going beyond that in the film. But the film uses, for me to say cartoons, suggests that the film is for children. It is definitely not for children. But it uses animation because there's virtually no film, from the period that she's talking about. So as she's narrating or someone else is narrating, we have this animation, explaining to us, the things that were happening in her life. But this is what I found disappointing about the film. But for a couple of instances where she is being interviewed, there's virtually no connection that is made with Islam. It's just simply speaking of it as human tragedy, as the result of war, as the result of human barbarity, all of which is true. But that barbarity was being driven by Islam. And she herself makes that point repeatedly in her book. And she does a couple of times in the film. But the film itself downplays that. And even more disappointing, the film downplays her Christian faith. So it's kind of like, some of you will recall the excellent book by, what's her name, Laura Hillenbrand, Unbroken. It's a terrific book. In fact, I would compare these books. This book and Unbroken are very similar. And yet, I would say for all of the suffering that Louis Zamperini, I think is his name in Unbroken, the World War II veteran who suffered under the Japanese, for all of his suffering, which is considerable, hers is worse, if you can imagine that. But the book, his Christian faith is emphasized. It's emphasized that that he becomes a Christian, goes to a Billy Graham, what do they call them? Billy Graham crusade, and he gives his life to Jesus Christ. That is the MacGuffin of the book. That's the turning point in the story arc. In the film that was made by Angelina Jolie, all that stuff is removed. And hence, the movie leaves you a little empty as to what the motivations were here. What were the motivations on the part of the Japanese? Emperor worship, the belief that other human beings were lesser than themselves. And what were the motivations of Louis Zamperini, who was a man of faith? The film misses all that. Now, is it because Angelina Jolie read the book and thought to herself, and by the way, this is perfectly possible. I don't know Angelina Jolie. I have no idea. But is it that she read it and thought, egads, I like this book and I'd like to make a movie out of it, but I want all the religious stuff out? Is it that, or is it because she read it and she conspired against the Christian faith deliberately to say, I'm going to lie in this film by removing all of that? I think it's more the first. I think it's because she's not a Christian, therefore she doesn't get the Christian faith. She doesn't understand the mindset of imperial Japanese soldiers. She doesn't get any of that, and therefore the story is told without any of the root causes that are driving the story. It's all missing, and it's all missing because she doesn't get it. She has no, and it's the same with these scholars. They don't get it because they can't. It's just absolutely alien to them. And therefore, Islam becomes a political force like any Western political party that just has some bad moments in its history. And as for the pedophilia and the sex trafficking and all that kind of stuff, the way they interpret that is, well, it's just a different culture. We need to be sensitive to that. They like marrying 9-year-olds. You see, what has happened in the Western world that I find fascinating is that wokedom, what we used to call political correctness, has absolutely severed the hamstring of the West. It has made the West vulnerable to an ideology. And by the way, it is an ideology of conquest. It's not a religion. Not in the way that the Western mind comprehends religion. It's an ideology of violence. It's an ideology of savagery. It's an ideology, by definition, of misogyny. It's an ideology, by definition, of anti-Semitism. It's an ideology of conquest. And the West, because of PC, political correctness, and wokedom, we have been made vulnerable to it. And that's because people are afraid that in identifying the connective tissue that exists, that is real, between Islam, the religion, and its evil theological underpinnings, and the evil actions of Islamic terrorist groups, of Muslims all over the world, they're afraid of being called racist. You see how the Red-Green Alliance is so real, and it's because the red part of the alliance is running interference for the green part of the alliance. They're the ones who are making the Western mind, making Western hearts vulnerable. In World War II, there was no unwillingness to associate the evil actions of German soldiers with their belief in their Fuhrer, with Nazism. We draw a direct link between the fascists of the Second World War, be they Japanese, be they Italian, or be they German, and the death camps. We say, nope, they're absolutely linked. We have to destroy the ideology. If we don't, there will be more death camps. There will be more deportations. There will be more annihilations of Jews and Slavs and everybody they disagree with. We realized, Douglas MacArthur realized in stepping ashore in Japan, that the only way Japan could become a stable democracy was if emperor worship was destroyed. If fascist imperial Japanese militarism was destroyed. Otherwise, Japan would just simply evolve to become that again at some later date. You had to attack the ideology, not just simply the actions that are an outgrowth of the ideology. You see where I'm going with this? When you're talking about what's happening in the West, all over the West, knifings, beheadings, church burnings, and you'll never convince me that Notre Dame wasn't burned down deliberately. Terrorist acts. It does no good to attribute it to guns. It does no good to attribute it to capitalist imperial oppression. It does no good to attribute it to global warming. You must identify the root ideology, the evil ideology that is behind it, or you have no hope of ending it. And this is why I began this survey of this literature, because I thought, I want to put something in the hands of people who listen to ideas have consequences. I want to put something in the hands of friends of mine, of other people I know, that I could say, I'm at some soiree and someone says, Larry, can you recommend a... Yes, I have a very good book I want to tell you to go read. And it's ideal because it won't overwhelm you by its academic jargon. It's not huge. It's not so big that it would choke a mule, or you could use it, as a chalk block, for a semi, or fill a pothole with it. It's small. And you'll finish it in a day at the beach. You'll finish it over the holiday in an afternoon. It's not long. And it is powerful because it is a firsthand account of someone who's actually suffered under it and who understands it. This is important for our understanding. This is what has to change in the West. This is what has to change. We have to get to a place where we understand what it is that we're grappling with and the way that we address it. But unfortunately, because of political correctness, because of wokedom, people are afraid to call it out, and they're afraid to even follow the breadcrumbs. And it is a kind of, I shouldn't say breadcrumbs, it's actually like a bloody trail that leads you to the root ideology that we're talking about here. I've mentioned this, I think, on this show before, but it bears repeating again. I published an article, I think it was with Spectator magazine, that I think the title was something like, I visited 13 terrorist sites. And I did. I visited more than that now, I think. But I was in Stockholm in 2016, shortly after, I believe it was April of 2016, March or April of that year, when a Muslim asylum seeker in Stockholm stole a beer truck, lapped the block, and went down a fashionable pedestrian path where people are, window shopping. I do believe I made mention of this fairly recently. And there was something to be learned from this, because I went and sat at a sidewalk cafe looking down this boulevard and trying to imagine the horror of the moment. And then I finished my coffee, I got up, and I went from store to store all the way down this street, asking people if they were there the day of the terrorist attack. And some of them didn't want to talk to me, which itself is telling. I mean, why would you be afraid to discuss this? Well, again, it's because of the PC aspect. It's because of wokedom. But one young woman did, and she was very thoughtful, a very beautiful young woman, and she spoke with deep emotion of that day, great feeling of what she saw. And she spoke very articulately and intelligently in English about all that happened. Very vivid description. And then when we got to the end of that conversation, I asked her this simple question: did Islam have anything to do with it? And she immediately changed. She didn't want to follow that bloody trail. So what I'm trying to tell you is what's happening here. She did not want to link Islam itself with the terrorist attack that she saw right outside her window. It was incredible to me. She saw that, she witnessed it, she knew from news reports after the fact. She knew who the man was, she knew what his religious convictions were, she knew what was driving him, what he himself said was driving him. But she immediately shut down the conversation. She wouldn't go any further. And she said, for me, it had nothing to do with religion. I just think that, he was just crazy. It would be exactly like speaking to a sailor aboard a U.S. battleship after a kamikaze. He'd just flown into the side of it, killing his friends. Big explosion, plume of smoke, and asking him, why do you think that guy did that? For me, I just don't think emperor worship had anything to do with that. I just think that guy was crazy. No, emperor worship had everything to do with it. The terrorist attacks that we're seeing coming they happen all over the world all the time. They just frequently go unreported. But the ones that we're now seeing with great regularity all over the West, these grooming gangs, it's exactly what Aurora Mardiganian is talking about, was happening to her a century ago. And if we had similar stories could have been written for every century by some woman, by some person since Islam's founding in the 7th century. Because it hasn't changed. And her story mirrors what's happening in Europe now. It mirrors what's happening in Europe now. And hence the reason that I recommend it to you. But how is it that people in past, and hence a reason why the West has been able to defend itself, a reason why the Western civilization has preserved itself for as long as it has been the ability to identify the evil ideas that are driving our enemies and addressing them, attacking them, refuting them in the marketplace of ideas. But now, it's like we're not intellectually capable of doing it. And it's not because people are stupid. Again, the scholars to which I refer anonymously, they're not dumb people. They're absent any religious impulse, and as a result, they don't understand religion. They don't get it. And you may say, well, how can Christians understand Islam? Very easy for Christians to. If you are a true believer in the Christian faith, it should be very easy for you to understand Islam. Why? Because their theology is the same? Because their holy books are the same? Absolutely not. But like Muslims, a Christian believes that there is an eternal God. Like Muslims, Christians believe that there are things worth dying for because this life is not all there is. Like Muslims, we believe in absolute truth. Like Muslims, we believe in judgment. Like Muslims, we believe in sacrificing on behalf of our faith. It's just they believe in a false God. But we can at least understand that. And when you do, you go, aha, the planes flying into the sides of those buildings on 9/11, that was a perfectly rational act given their worldview. That it would achieve salvation, martyrdom. It becomes easy to understand. But if you don't have an understanding of religious conviction, you look at an act like that and you go, those people they're unhinged. They're nuts. There's something mentally broken with them. No, they were raised to believe that. They were taught that, and they were willing to die for that. Ladies and gentlemen, we say on this show, ideas have consequences. That's the name of the show. Ideas have consequences. And I always feel like every week what I'm trying to do, I want you to see the ideas behind the things that we see happening in our world today. So, for example, when we were discussing open borders, I was explaining to you the philosophy of Karl Popper, the 20th century philosopher who wrote a multi-volume work called The Open Society and Its Enemies. And I told you, guess who was a student of his at the London School of Economics? George Soros. Not surprisingly, George Soros goes on to found a nonprofit called the Open Society Foundation. It's not an accident. There's a connective link. You can follow the idea to where it is. I've sought to explain to you the rise of atheism, especially since the publication of Origin of Species in 1859, and the direct link between that and genocide in the 20th century. And that's because all these secular states rose and came to the conclusion, there's no God to judge us in the next life for our actions in this one. We can do whatever the hell we want and get away with it. I've sought to explain to you the ideas behind a number of things that we see happening in our world. And now one that serves to threaten the West, and as I say, it's like a giant pincer movement. On the one hand, you have the radical left, and the seat of those ideas is Davos, or at least one of them, where the World Economic Forum meets. But on the other hand, we are seeing this aggressive Islam stretching out into the West and now into the United States. The number of mosques being built in Texas alone is absolutely staggering, and it must be stopped. It must be stopped. Now, Google is going to shut me down here, YouTube, because I guess X itself, by the way, these days feels like it's once again being run by all the lefties who are suppressing conservative accounts. But I do really, really, really want to encourage you to read this little book. Gift it to other people. It will serve to help them understand what Islam actually is. And I would also encourage you to underscore for them so they don't do what Angelina Jolie did. She reads the unbroken Louis Zamperini story, and then she misses the religious context of his story. You need to underscore for them what it was that sustained her Christian faith, and what it was that victimized her, Islam. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.